I am now on the MTK hotline, and I would like to welcome back to the show a very special guest from the north of England, Mr. Derek Shelmerdine. Derek is the resident rock and roll historian of the show. He's also the author of the fabulous book Rock and Roll Unravelled, and of course the host of our own Unravelled segment here on the show. Derek, welcome back to the Mop Tops and the King.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be back.
It's wonderful to have you back on the show. So, before we begin, I have your book, Rock and Roll Unraveled, right here. It's a great reference. How long did it take you to write this book?
Well, a lifetime of enjoyment of the music, but actually putting the book together was around about 8 years, 7 or 8 years.
Wow. It really is a fantastic book, and I recommend my listeners to check it out.
Thanks.
So, today we're going to discuss one of the most talked about events in Beatle history, and that's the firing of original Beatles drummer Pete Best. So let's get right to it. What are some of the reasons and theories of why Pete Best was fired from the Beatles in August of '62?
There are various ones and contradictory, depending who you're listening to. But, he was too good looking. They were jealous of him. He was a poor drummer. He wouldn't conform. And also that they wanted to remove his mother, Mona Best, who was actually a big wheel in the Liverpool scene in the 60s. She owned a club and was a promoter of bands. Now, Pete Best, in an interview in 2018, says, "To this day, hand on heart, I don't know the actual reason I was fired." And I think that's the thing that comes through. I've done quite a lot of delving into this. And that's what keeps coming back all the time. Putting a finger on a particular cause depends on who you're listening to. He described how it happened in an interview, and he said he was called into Brian Epstein, the manager's office, and he was told, "The boys want you out. They want Ringo in." And he says that Brian was the hat-trick guy. It wasn't really Brian's decision. And interestingly, none of the Beatles were there. And they've never, ever spoken since, even though they've passed getting on and off the same stage. And as for the non-conforming, they're usually referred to as for the hairstyle. Pete's, I've seen him say it a few times, he was never asked to wear his hair in a fringe.
Right.
And the other interesting one's George Martin. He often gets the blame. But I saw an interesting interview with him where he told Brian Epstein that, Pete wasn't a very good drummer, but there's no reason why, to the public, Pete Best shouldn't be part of the group. He just wanted to get a session drummer in for the recordings. Of course, he didn't like Ringo either at the second recording of Love Me Do. And Andy White you hear most of the time on the Love Me Do.
You know a bit about drumming, because I know you're a drummer yourself. And I'm curious, what's your opinion of Pete Best's drumming? Was he terrible, or was he okay?
I wouldn't have said he was better or worse than Ringo. He was a typical Beat-era drummer. Drumming wasn't that complicated in the Beat era, the mid-'60s. It got very complicated when rock music arrived in the second half of the 1960s. But it wasn't unusual for producers to want to get session musicians in.
The other thing that you had mentioned about Pete Best's mother, Mona, that angle is very interesting. I have heard that one before. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, but that's exactly the case. There's another major promoter in Liverpool at that time, a guy called Sam Leach, and he puts all the blame onto Brian. And what he said is, Brian didn't want anyone who knew the Beatles before him. And that would particularly be Mona Best and Sam Leach. In fact, Sam Leach produced this big gig in the November of '61 with 4,000 people at it. And on the poster, underneath the Beatles' name, it says, "By kind permission of Mrs. Best."
Ah.
So that's quite an interesting take.
So they were successful. They got rid of Mona by getting rid of Pete. That's an interesting angle.
But the Beatles themselves, in the anthology book, they make some really interesting comments. John says that Pete and Paul didn't really get on much together. And then he goes on to say the reason they got into the group in the first place was because they needed a drummer to go to Hamburg,
right,
which is what Alan Williams, the guy who got them the gig, told them they'd have to do. But then he says, John Lennon says, we were always planning to dump him. Now, Pete was with them for 2 years, and in January of '62, 8 months before he was sacked, they topped the local music paper Mersey Beat poll. So drummers would have been falling over themselves if that had been the case. But it's Paul that's the most contradictory. And he says that George Martin told them that he was unhappy with the drummer. Would they change him? And Paul says no. we don't want to, but he was concerned they might lose the contract. And then he goes on to say, quote, it was strictly a professional decision. And then a sentence or two further on, he goes on to say it was actually a personality thing. He was slightly different from the rest of us, not quite as studenty. And then they bring Ringo in, who was extremely studenty. But it was George himself who takes complete credit for the sacking. He says, to me it was apparent Pete wasn't showing up for gigs, we get Ringo to sit in. And what he says was, I was quite responsible for stirring things up. I conspired to get Ringo in for good. I talked to Paul and John until they finally came around. So he puts it very much down to himself.
Interesting. That's George Harrison, by the way.
That's George Harrison. Oh, yes, you've got to be careful with George talking about that. Yeah, I was Harrison.
We're speaking with Derek Shelmerdine, the resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops and the King. Derek, what do you think the real reason was that Pete Best was canned?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of jealousy there. He was by far the best looking of the guys, and the girls would run past the other three to Pete to get his autograph. And the group was being referred to by some people as Pete Best and the Beatles.
Derek, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. We love your Unravelled segments. We love the book. We're going to send you off with a track from the Pete Best Band from 2008. It's a song that Pete Best co-wrote. He plays the drums, and a guy by the name of Tony Flynn provides the lead vocals. The song is called Gray River. And thanks again, Derek, for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed chatting to you, Steve. Cheers, mate.